Hello, and welcome to the Prime Movie Recaps. Today, we are going to take a look at the 2014 action and thriller film called Son of Gun. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. JR, a 19-year-old juvenile, is sentenced to 6 months in an Australian prison as punishment for a minor infraction. During his first few days at the jail, he discovers that his cellmate is being sexually assaulted by a group of prisoners led by a man named Dave. JR also meets Brendan Lynch, Australia's most hated armed robber. Lynch is playing correspondence chess with his cellmate. A passing JR points out a checkmate against him and demonstrates the move, and is dismissed. JR later discovers his cellmate sharpening the shiv in an attempt to defend himself against Dave. When Dave and his crew come to attack the cellmate, JR starts a fight to stop Dave and his crew from attacking the cellmate. Lynch criticizes JR for being involved in the business of others. However, shortly thereafter, the cellmate is sexually assaulted yet again. His cellmate attempts suicide, and he is taken to hospital. Dave then turns his sexual attacks against JR. Dave and his gang attempt to rape JR. Lynch and his men, Merv and Sterlo, rescue JR and then kill Dave, in exchange for Lynch's protection throughout JR imprisonment. JR agrees to do work for him after he is released. 6 months later, he was finally released. JR is introduced to crime king, Sam, with whom Lynch is playing chess, and his nephew Josh. An apartment is provided for him, as well as a briefcase containing fake passports, clothing, and a gun. A lovely young lady named Tasha soon comes to the apartment to give JR some cash and a cell phone, which he uses to receive instructions. JR, in compliance with directions, visits Private Wilson at his dwelling and illegally purchases various assault weapons. After receiving the instructions, JR takes over a helicopter used for scenic tours and directs the pilot, at gunpoint, to fly to the prison Lynch is still being held at. Sterlo and Murph set up an escape plan by having one of the guards captive until JR helicopter comes to take them away. The 4 men get out of the helicopter and leave it in a field, where they drive off in a getaway vehicle. Merv is buying food at a convenience store while the car is stopped at a gas station. The 3 other boys discover that Merv was in prison for raping a Perth schoolgirl. Lynch and Sterlo were able to discover that Merv had lied. Lynch beat Merv brutally and expelled him from the crew shortly after. The 3 traveled to Sam's mansion, where he asked Lynch and his men to pull off a gold robbery in Calgary, where the possible profits are millions of dollars. Afterward, at the estate, there is a party, and JR sees Tasha, who he follows to the pool side. Josh decides to harass JR and pushes him into the pool. JR is unable on account of his inability to swim. Tasha rushes to his rescue and departs with him for supper at a Chinese restaurant. Here, Tasha explains her past relationship with Sam and how those that run from him are murdered. The next morning, Lynch warns JR against being distracted by Tasha. They then go to the quarry they will break into. Lynch informs JR that his responsibility in the heist will be to access the room with the gold and guarantee that no quarry employees activate the panic button. Chris, a rally racer recruited by Lynch, becomes the getaway driver. Back at Sam's mansion, a fight erupts between JR and Josh when they discuss plans for the robbery. The fight is over, and Lynch tells JR to settle down. At the bar, JR sees Tasha and scares away some men who were harassing her. Tasha is furious with him for scaring away the men since she does not have proper immigration papers, telling JR that he was being stupid. She asks JR to meet her in the lake near his home when he invites her out for coffee. Later that evening, JR sneaks away to meet Tasha. He skinny dips with Tasha, and they have sex on the water. The heist is followed the next day. The gang enters the quarry and inserts JR into the ventilation shaft above the gold room, where he successfully intimidates the gold room workers not to press the panic button, allowing the rest of his team inside. Lynch next leads 2 employees down a chute to fill gold bars, but this goes against the script and asks Josh to watch the workers while JR keeps an eye on the gold pouring. This irritates Josh, who subsequently fires an employee in the leg. Lynch smashes Josh's nose with a shotgun stock, and he returns to keeping an eye on the gold pour. After police arrive, the group enters into plain view as workers, although they pretend to be holding guns on real employees. Lynch then frees the hostages and fires on police cars and personnel. Chris arrives with a getaway vehicle, but on their way out, Sterlo is shot through the abdomen and starts bleeding profusely. Chris succeeds in disabling the 2 pursuing police cars and escaping, but Sterlo dies at the conclusion of the chase, urging Lynch to give his share of the heist to his wife. Sam betrays Lynch, JR, and Tasha, but they all get away safely. The 3 of them go to Melbourne, where Sam has arranged to meet his fence. In an attempt to ambush the meeting, JR and Lynch kill Sam's henchman and kidnap Josh in the process. They interrogate Josh after finding the gold hidden in a storage unit. Sam is murdered by Lynch and JR in his mansion before fleeing for good. Lynch offers JR $350 to go away. It's here that we learn that when JR figured out that once he had the gold, Lynch would discard him. He devised a plan to steal the treasure with Tasha and take half. Lynch has no choice but to accept JR's conditions and wait before he receives the gold. Though, a woman in a laundromat recognizes him as the escaped convict, and Lynch is imprisoned again. Later, JR sends Lynch a postcard with directions to the gold that was left for him. A pregnant Tasha is depicted on it, suggesting a bright future. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this and turn on notifications. And leave a comment to help the channel out.